England stands on the edge of destruction. German bombers darken the skies almost every night, their engines screaming over the channel as entire cities burn beneath them. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered and desperate, needs a new kind of weapon, a bomber that could fly farther, carry more, and survive the brutal reach of German fire. But the aircraft they needed didn't exist. And the man who tried to build it, an ordinary engineer named Roy Chadwick, was told his design was impossible, impractical, even foolish. The Air Ministry rejected it, dismissing it as a fantasy that could never fly. Yet within a few short years, that same rejected design would rise from the scrap heap of bureaucracy to become the backbone of the Allied air war. The legendary Avro Lancaster. This is not just the story of a machine, it's the story of one man's defiance in the face of doubt, and how an idea too radical for its time became a symbol of courage for an entire generation. When Roy Chadwick first placed his blueprints on the worn oak table of the Avro design office, he wasn't chasing glory, he was chasing survival. Britain had been battered by Luftwaffe raids for months, and the RAF's twin-engine bombers simply couldn't strike deep enough into German territory to make a difference. Every mission came at a terrible cost. Crews never returned. Cities crumbled. Morale bled away like smoke over the ruins of London. Chadwick believed there had to be another way, a bomber that could fly higher, farther, faster, and deliver more than any before it. His concept was bold: 4 massive Rolls-Royce Merlin engines mounted on a sleek airframe, carrying a bomb load 3 times greater than any existing aircraft. But the ministry's response was swift and brutal. Too heavy, too complicated, too ambitious. They wanted reliability, not revolution. To them, Chadwick's creation was a dreamer's folly. But Chadwick wasn't a dreamer. He was a builder, and he had seen enough of war to know that conventional thinking was a death sentence. Each day he returned to his small drafting table in Manchester, surrounded by the smell of oil, steel, and paper soaked with ink and sweat. Outside, air raid sirens howled as the city braced for another night of terror. Yet while the world above was being torn apart, Chadwick's mind was assembling something that could change it. He worked long into the night, tracing lines that might someday save lives he would never meet. When the power flickered and bombs fell nearby, he kept his pencil steady. "If it can't be done," he once said, "then it must be done differently." To him, that was not defiance. It was duty. Months turned to years, and still the Air Ministry refused him. They called his bomber too risky, too expensive, too advanced for wartime urgency. But something changed in 1941. The British Air Staff, desperate for a new heavy bomber, reluctantly gave Chadwick a second chance. They needed a miracle, and Chadwick gave them one. Using the failed Avro Manchester, a twin-engine disaster that had cost countless lives, he began redesigning from the ground up. He stretched its frame, doubled its engines, rebalanced its wings, and reinforced its fuselage to carry unimaginable weight. Every rivet, every bolt, every wire was a quiet rebellion against failure. What emerged from his reimagined design was no longer the Manchester. It was something entirely new, a leviathan of the skies that would soon be called the Lancaster. When the first prototype rolled out of the hangar at Woodford in early 1941, engineers stood in silence. The sunlight glinted off its silver body, the air thick with the smell of fuel and hot metal. It looked both elegant and dangerous, a machine that seemed almost alive. Mechanics whispered that it would never lift off the ground. Others said it would change the war. Only Chadwick stood still, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had poured his heart, his mind, and his sleepless nights into this moment. As the engines roared to life, the noise was deafening, shaking dust from the rafters. The ground crew stepped back, shielding their faces from the blast of propellers. And then, against all expectation, the Lancaster began to move, slowly at first, then faster, until it tore down the runway and lifted into the sky with impossible grace. Watching it rise, Chadwick felt something he hadn't allowed himself in years: hope. The rejected bomber had just taken flight, but the skies of war are cruel, and for Chadwick and his creation, the battle was only beginning. As the Lancaster thundered through its first official test flights, the air around Woodford seemed to tremble with disbelief. Engineers leaned out from hangar doors, watching the massive aircraft slice through the gray winter sky, its four Merlins growling in perfect unison. The bomber's silhouette, broad wings, glass nose, heavy fuselage, was unlike anything the RAF had ever seen. Test pilots described it as a gentle giant, a machine so well balanced it could glide even on one engine. Yet behind the success of those flights lay a quiet war of its own, the battle between innovation and fear. The Air Ministry still doubted Chadwick's dream. They wanted proof that the aircraft could survive real combat, withstand enemy fire, and carry bomb loads that no one thought possible. The challenge was brutal. They demanded that the bomber not just fly, it had to endure everything the war could throw at it. Chadwick faced impossible deadlines. Britain's resources were stretched thin, factories worked under blackout conditions, and raw materials were rationed like gold. Steel, rubber, and aluminum were reserved for proven designs, not untested experiments. The Avro team was forced to improvise using scrap materials, remachined parts, and even components from wrecked planes. Yet through exhaustion and shortage, something extraordinary began to take shape. The Lancaster's frame was strengthened with precision engineering, each joint and beam carefully calculated to absorb stress. Its bomb bay doors were lengthened to hold the largest payloads in Allied history. Chadwick's obsession was not speed, but reliability. He believed a bomber's true power lay not in how fast it could strike, but in whether it could bring its crew home alive. Every nut and bolt was a silent promise to the men who would fly it. In the cold dawns of 1941, mechanics worked in silence as condensation froze on their overalls. They tightened bolts with numb fingers, hammered panels into place by lantern light, and wiped grease from their hands while air raid sirens wailed in the distance. Overhead, the faint glow of incendiary bombs lit the clouds red. Manchester was under fire again, but no one stopped working. For them, the Lancaster wasn't just a machine. It was a lifeline, a chance to hit back, to end the bombings that were tearing their homeland apart. Chadwick walked the hangar floors every night, inspecting the smallest details, his eyes hollow with fatigue. He spoke little, but every glance carried the same message. Failure was not an option. When the Lancaster was finally approved for operational testing, it was sent to the RAF's Elite Bomber Command. Pilots, many of whom had survived the disastrous Manchester missions, eyed the new plane with skepticism. "Just another death trap," one of them muttered as he climbed aboard. But the moment they took off, everything changed. The Lancaster soared higher, flew smoother, and carried heavier loads than any bomber before it. Crews marveled at how stable it felt under pressure, how it responded like a living thing even when engines faltered or bullets tore through its skin. After the first mission, the squadron's leader sent a simple message back to Avro. "Tell Chadwick, it works." Word spread quickly through the bases. The rejected design was proving unstoppable. The RAF began converting entire squadrons to the new aircraft, and by 1942, the Lancaster was leading deep penetration raids over occupied Europe. From the frozen airfields of Lincolnshire to the thunderous skies over Berlin, its roar became a sound of defiance, a promise that Britain still had fight left in her. Each takeoff was a gamble with death, yet pilots trusted the Lancaster like no other. It could take punishment and still come home. Bullet holes, shredded wings, burning engines, it didn't matter. Somehow it always made it back. But for Roy Chadwick, triumph was shadowed by loss. Every time he heard of a Lancaster that failed to return, he felt it personally. To him, these weren't statistics. They were men, brothers, friends. He carried their faces with him as he worked on each new upgrade, each improvement designed to keep them alive a little longer. "We build for the living," he once said quietly, "but every improvement is paid for by the dead." The Lancaster was no longer just his creation. It was his burden. And as the war deepened, that burden was about to grow heavier than ever before. By 1942, the war had entered its most brutal phase, and the Lancaster had become the weapon Britain pinned its hopes on. Every night, its engines growled across the blackened skies of Europe, carrying crews barely out of their teens into the heart of enemy fire. The missions were relentless, the odds unforgiving. Searchlights clawed at the darkness. Flak tore holes through the sky, and night fighters hunted the bombers like shadows. Yet through the storm of death, the Lancaster proved itself over and over again. It carried payloads twice what any other aircraft could lift in return from missions that should have been suicide. For the airmen, it wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a companion, a guardian forged from steel, sweat, in the stubborn will of a man who refused to accept failure. In the icy night air, inside the cramped metal fuselage, crews whispered to each other between bursts of turbulence. The roar of the engines was constant, a deafening heartbeat that never stopped. Frost crept along the glass canopy, oxygen masks froze, and hands shook not from fear, but from the freezing altitude. When flak bursts lit the sky, the cockpit glowed white for a split second, revealing faces tight with concentration and silent prayers. They called it the Widowmaker's Run, yet they kept going back. Because the Lancaster could do what no other bomber could, it could carry the Grand Slam, the heaviest bomb ever dropped in the war, and it could deliver it with unerring precision. Roy Chadwick's design had achieved what no one believed possible, but the price was unbearable. Night after night, telegrams reached Avro's offices, lists of crews lost, bombers that vanished without a trace. Chadwick read them all. He knew each serial number, each pilot's name. He would stand alone in the hangar, staring at the rows of new Lancasters waiting to fly, and wonder how many would return. He couldn't tell his team that he barely slept anymore. He couldn't admit that every improvement they made was haunted by the sound of those missing engines. Yet he kept working, tirelessly, obsessively, refining every inch of the aircraft to make survival more than just a miracle. And then came the mission that would define the Lancaster forever. Operation Chastise, better known as the Dam Busters Raid. In 1943, Britain's High Command sought a way to cripple Germany's industrial heart, the Ruhr Valley. The idea was as audacious as it was insane: to destroy massive dams protected by flak, searchlights, and concrete walls by using a new kind of weapon, a bouncing bomb. Barnes-Wallis had invented it, but only one bomber could carry it, fly low enough, and remain steady at treetop level under enemy fire. That bomber was the Lancaster. Chadwick personally oversaw modifications to the aircraft, stripped down fuselage, strengthened undercarriage, specialized bomb bay mounts. He watched as Squadron 617 took off into the night, their engines fading into the horizon like ghosts. The mission was chaos. Flying at barely 60 feet above water, pilots faced machine gun fire, exploding flak, and impossible navigation. Some never made it back, but those who did changed history. The dams were shattered, entire valleys flooded, and Germany's war machine crippled for months. When news reached Avro, Chadwick said nothing for hours. He simply stared at a photograph of the returning crews, exhausted, mud-streaked, hollow-eyed, and whispered, "They did it." The rejected bomber had just achieved what the most advanced designs in the world could not. It had struck a blow so daring, so precise, that it became legend overnight. But while the world celebrated, Chadwick knew the truth beneath the triumph. The Lancaster's power came not from brilliance alone, but from sacrifice. Every mission left men behind, engines silent, planes burning across fields, families waiting for telegrams that never came. The bomber that once symbolized redemption had become a double-edged sword, and its creator carried both sides in his heart. He had given the Allies their most formidable weapon, but in doing so, he had built a machine that demanded the lives of heroes. By the summer of 1944, the World War was on the edge of turning. The Allies prepared for the largest invasion in human history, D-Day. And once again, the bomber Britain had once thrown aside would lead the way. The Lancaster became the silent hammer before the storm, flattening enemy defenses, rail lines, and communication hubs across occupied France. Every takeoff was a gamble, every return a miracle. The roar of its 4 Merlin engines echoed like a promise across the English countryside, a sound that meant hope to those waiting on the ground and death to those who stood in its path. The hangars at Avro never slept. Sparks flew, wrenches clanged, blueprints lay scattered under dim lights. Roy Chadwick and his engineers worked in silence, their faces lined with exhaustion and pride. They knew that each aircraft was more than steel and rivets. It was a lifeline, built for the boys who flew into darkness and dared not look back. On the night of June 5th, as rain lashed across the airfields of southern England, hundreds of Lancasters stood ready in neat rows, engines humming in the mist. The crews climbed aboard, young men barely past 20, some clutching good luck charms, others writing final letters they knew might never be read. The smell of oil, the vibration of engines, the taste of fear in the cold air, it all blended into one moment of stillness before the storm. When the command came, the bombers thundered down the runways one by one, lifting into the night like iron phantoms. Their target, the coastal defenses that could tear apart the invasion before it began. The first explosions lit up the coastline hours before dawn, and from that chaos, Operation Overlord was born. As the war pressed deeper into Europe, the Lancaster adapted again and again. From precision strikes in daylight to daring night raids, in enemy territory, it became the spine of Allied air power. But with each victory, the shadows grew heavier. Losses mounted, not in dozens but in thousands. For every Lancaster that returned, another was gone, swallowed by fire and flak. Chadwick visited bases quietly, never for recognition, but to meet the crews. He shook their hands, listened to their stories, and carried their words back to his desk. One pilot told him, "She flies like she knows where home is." That sentence haunted him for years. In 1945, when the war was finally ending, Chadwick received word of a mission unlike any before. Operation Mana. Instead of bombs, Lancasters would carry food. Starving civilians in the Netherlands, trapped by war and winter, were dying by the thousands. The bombers, once symbols of destruction, became angels in the sky. They flew low over ruined cities, bomb bays filled not with explosives, but with sacks of flour, bread, and hope. Civilians waved from rooftops, weeping as parachutes drifted down. For Chadwick, it was the first time the aircraft he built carried life instead of death. The same machine that had crushed Germany's war effort now fed its victims. For a moment, it felt as though the ghosts were quiet. But history has a way of taking as much as it gives. In 1947, 2 years after the war, Roy Chadwick climbed aboard an Avro Tudor, one of his new post-war designs. It was meant to be a symbol of peace, a step toward the skies of a different world. Minutes after takeoff, the plane crashed. The man who had built legends died just as quietly as he had lived. Not in battle, but in flight. When they recovered his notes, one line was underlined twice. Perfection is never finished. It was as if he knew his work, his spirit, would keep flying long after him. Across Europe, rusting Lancasters were retired, dismantled, or forgotten. Yet a few survived, preserved in museums or kept alive by the hands of those who remembered what they stood for. Each time one takes to the sky, even today, its engines echo through time, the sound of one man's defiance, one machine's redemption, and the countless souls it carried between life and death. What began as a rejected bomber had become the heart of a nation's resistance and a symbol of human resilience that would outlive the war it helped end. When the guns finally fell silent and the world began to rebuild, the story of the rejected bomber faded quietly into the background noise of history. Nations celebrated victory, heroes were decorated, but men like Roy Chadwick were rarely mentioned. He was no soldier, no pilot, no general, just an engineer who believed that even broken ideas could fly. Yet it was his machine, born from rejection and built from sheer faith, that carried the weight of nations across the sky. In the ruins of Europe, where silence replaced sirens and smoke cleared to reveal a bruised horizon, the legacy of his creation lingered like the low hum of distant engines. Veterans would tell their children how the Lancaster's shadow passed above them on the night before liberation, how its engines sounded like the heartbeat of hope itself. The Lancaster became more than a weapon. It was a bridge between despair and deliverance. Every bolt and beam in its frame carried the memory of those who dared to defy impossibility. The young men who climbed into its narrow fuselage never knew if they would return, yet they trusted the machine. And through it, the man who built it. That trust, that fragile faith between human and invention, was what truly won the war. In every flight through flak-lit skies, in every desperate dive to escape searchlights, the spirit of its creation, the refusal to surrender, kept it alive. The bomber that no one wanted became the one the world could not do without. Years later, when the surviving Lancasters were grounded, their final flights drew tears from crowds that had once cheered their return from battle. Mechanics touched the cold wings with reverence. Pilots stood in silence, and for a moment the memories of fear and fire were replaced by pride. They were saying goodbye not to a machine, but to an era, to the courage that had taken shape in metal and flame. And as historians wrote of strategies and generals, the truth quietly remained in the echoes of those engines. History was not changed by orders alone, but by ordinary people who refused to let their ideas die. In the end, the story of the Lancaster and of Roy Chadwick is not just about war. It is about vision born from rejection and greatness forged in doubt. It is about the power of one mind, unshaken by failure, to reshape the fate of millions. Because every invention, every act of defiance, begins with a single thought. What if they're wrong about me? Chadwick's legacy reminds us that progress is never built by those who accept rejection, but by those who rise from it. The sky that once carried his creation now carries his message, that in every era,